What if awakening doesn't set you free in the way you imagined? What if, instead of igniting your soul, it leaves you standing in silence, wondering where your fire went? Somewhere along the journey of awakening, maybe after a sudden spiritual revelation or a quiet collapse of the identity you once clung to, you felt everything shift. The world that was once familiar began to look and feel entirely foreign. You glimpsed beyond the veil, saw through the illusions that held your life together, and for a moment, it felt like stepping into clarity. You could suddenly hear the noise of the world, feel the hollowness of the roles you played, and then came the silence. That silence at first was sacred. It was like stepping out of a burning building into clean, healing air. It wasn't just peaceful, it was profound. But slowly, gently, something unexpected began to happen. The silence didn't turn into wisdom or purpose. Instead, meaning itself began to fade. Not dramatically, but like the quiet turning down of a dimmer switch. Your soul, once ablaze, seemed to forget to turn the lights back on. What if your lack of motivation isn't failure, but transformation? You stopped striving, you stopped trying to impress or prove, but not because you were broken. This wasn't burnout, it was something more mysterious, a kind of sacred exhaustion, a quiet, peaceful hollowing out. You weren't panicked, you weren't even sad. But you felt unnervingly still, like you were standing in a pause between the notes of a song that used to define your life. Then, without warning, a whisper came. A small but aching question began to form inside you. Why do I feel so empty now that I finally see the truth? This is the paradox that so few speak of. We're taught to believe that spiritual awakening will set us ablaze with purpose, that once we see the light, we'll be filled with passion, energy, and unstoppable clarity. But that's not what happens for many, especially for the deep feelers, the inward seekers, the empaths, and the sensitive souls who've spent lifetimes attuned to the emotional undercurrents of existence. For these souls, awakening doesn't ignite a fire. It empties the vessel. What if your soul is clearing space, not giving up? This process doesn't come with explosions of inspiration. It arrives like a gentle sweep, a scraping away of everything that isn't true. It scrubs out old motivations, those built on fear, comparison, and the need for validation, until even desire becomes unrecognizable. And in that unfamiliar void, we confuse awakening with apathy. A friend of mine, let's call her Samira, went through this. She was wise beyond her years, deeply spiritual, fluent in teachings by many modern thinkers. She emerged from a deep internal shift with clear, profound insight. She told me she'd seen through the illusions of ego, success, and external love. But 2 months later, I found her lying in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't worried about not achieving. She had stopped caring whether she ever did anything again. I thought awakening would light me up, she said, but instead, I feel extinguished. What if the emptiness after awakening is the beginning of your soul's recreation? Carl Jung, the brilliant mind behind analytical psychology, spoke to this exact phenomenon. He described it not as a mistake or a malfunction, but as a sacred stage, a threshold, the sacred terrain between the collapse of the ego and the emergence of the true self. This in-between space isn't a glitch in your growth. It's not laziness. It's not dysfunction. It's a phase of transformation, what Jung referred to as the chrysalis stage of the psyche. The ego dissolves, the false self breaks down, and what's left is the raw clay of what's to come. But this clay hasn't yet taken shape. The identity you once wore has fallen away, but the new one hasn't arrived. This is not a regression. It's the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are. What if what you're experiencing is not apathy, but alchemy? You're not failing. You're not falling apart. What you're experiencing is a sacred psychological death, a dismantling of the scaffolding that once held up your entire identity. Your ambitions, your achievements, your cravings for recognition all begin to fade like distant echoes. The timelines you used to follow, the 5-year plans that used to excite you, even the labels and routines that gave you a sense of structure, start slipping through your fingers. Not because you no longer care, but because those structures were built for someone you no longer are. This is where Carl Jung's wisdom is so vital. He warned that the ego doesn't disappear, it just becomes disoriented. The script it once followed so confidently has been burned, but no new script has been handed to you yet. So, you stand there, empty, confused, but not broken. This isn't laziness, it's limbo. It's the sacred pause between death and rebirth. Jung called this the nigredo, or blackening phase of alchemy. It's a deep inner dismantling. In modern words, it feels like demotivation. In Jung's language, it's holy stillness. The soul is withdrawing so it can rewrite its myth. What if your stillness is sacred, but misunderstood? Modern culture has no patience for this phase. It doesn't understand silence unless it's followed by success. So it tries to medicate the pause, label it as depression, or pathologize it as dysfunction. But Jung was clear. What you're experiencing isn't dysfunction, it's initiation. This is not clinical depression, though it may feel adjacent. This is your soul refusing to keep participating in a version of life that no longer resonates. It's not giving up, it's stepping away from illusion, from performance, from pretense. Jung believed this moment marks the true beginning of individuation. It's the birth of your actual self, not the version society applauded, but the one that rings true in silence, the one that no longer seeks applause, but seeks truth. People don't talk about this part, the ache that comes after the revelation, the eerie silence that follows seeing the truth. But that silence, it's not a void, it's a womb. What if what feels like emptiness is sacred preparation? If you're here, drifting in the haze after awakening, if you find yourself staring into that vast stillness where your spark once lived, know this: you are not broken. You are undergoing a psychic shift so deep, so profound, that it defies language. It's not just about new thoughts or insights, it's a reconfiguration of your inner architecture. Your psyche is clearing out everything artificial, everything forced, everything not aligned with truth. The mantras, the deadlines, the motivation tactics that once fueled you, they fall flat now. And not because you failed, but because the fuel itself no longer fits the engine of your soul. Jung saw this coming long before our culture gave it a name. He knew that the fire of the ego burns out, so the light of the self can begin. What if everything you once were was just rehearsal for the real you? Most of your life, your energy, came from what Jung called the persona, the mask you wore to meet society's expectations, the part of you that longed to be admired, accepted, validated. And that persona, it wasn't wrong, it was a stage of development. Jung wrote, "The persona is a system of behavior imposed by society's expectations. But once you awaken, the mask begins to slip. You start to see the performance, and suddenly you can't pretend anymore. The applause doesn't move you. The old goals feel like relics from another lifetime. You try to get back into character, but the lines no longer make sense. You've outgrown the role. And so you feel aimless, not because you've lost your direction, but because the self that once needed a direction no longer exists. You haven't lost your motivation. You've lost the illusion that once required it. What rises now is not nothingness, but a sacred pause, a clearing, a quiet waiting for something more authentic to emerge. What if your next chapter isn't about pushing forward, but pausing long enough to hear your soul's voice? In this strange stillness, you begin to sense it. Something shifting underneath the silence. You didn't lose your drive. You simply outgrew the fuel that once powered it. The ego pushes, it thrives on effort, urgency, performance. But the soul waits, it listens, and in that waiting, something sacred begins to stir. This isn't burnout, it's the beginning of alignment. Carl Jung believed that the purpose of life isn't to glorify the ego, but to integrate it, to temper it with the deeper wisdom of the self. He wrote that individuation is the path from fragmentation to wholeness, not to become the self that wins praise, but to become the self that feels real. That real self doesn't chase applause. It doesn't compete. It doesn't seek to dominate. It simply aligns. Its only desire is to express what is deeply, inarguably true. What if your soul is rejecting what your ego built because you're ready for something more honest? After a true awakening, the psyche enters a sacred recalibration. You begin to feel it in your body, your relationships, your work. What once felt thrilling now feels hollow. Even your dreams, the ones you used to cling to, begin to feel foreign. Suddenly, careers built from insecurity start to feel heavy. Relationships based on roles feel stifling. Even the vision board crafted by your old fears no longer inspires you. You're shedding the false. But the real hasn't fully arrived yet, and in that space, there's uncertainty, confusion, a strange grief. Jung cautioned that many people get stuck here. They awaken but then float above life, mistaking detachment for transcendence. They say none of this matters and call it peace, but it's often just escape. It's a bypass. The self doesn't want you to retreat. It wants to incarnate through you. It doesn't want disconnection. It wants embodiment. What if your confusion is proof that you're no longer pretending? Jung described this space with piercing clarity. It is the gray zone after awakening, the void that doesn't come with bliss, but with bewilderment. It doesn't look poetic. It doesn't trend. It looks like sitting on the edge of your bed while the rest of the world races past, unable to explain what's happening to you. You're not failing, Jung might say. You are in between. You've stepped out of the ego, but the self hasn't yet fully taken the reins. This liminal space is not a detour. It's the path itself. But modern culture, in its obsession with progress, tries to label this sacred stage as laziness, lack, or failure. And so, we begin to judge ourselves. And that judgment becomes the very wall that blocks the energy our soul is calling home. This is not collapse. It is chrysalis. What if the extremes of your journey are part of nature's balance, swinging you into wholeness? Carl Jung called this shift enantiodromia, the phenomenon where things, when taken to an extreme, transform into their opposite. Before awakening, we were driven by ambition, achievement, and the frantic need to do. After awakening, we collapse into stillness, asking, why do anything at all? The pendulum doesn't swing because you're lost. It swings because balance demands it. Your psyche, imprisoned for so long in performance, is now collapsing into rest. It's not pathology. It's transformation. In mythology, this is the hermit, the one who withdraws before re-entering the world. This is the cocoon phase, where the caterpillar dissolves into goo. It's messy, it's unproductive, it's unseen, but it's necessary. Transformation doesn't begin in light. It begins in darkness, not in good vibes only, but in descent, in honesty, in shadow. What if your shadows are not your enemy, but your invitation to wholeness? Modern spirituality often glamorizes awakening while skipping the part where it dismantles you. But Jung never did that. He understood that the shadow, the parts of ourselves we deny or suppress, isn't something to run from. It's the foundation of real transformation. In this stillness, the unconscious rises. Your grief, your rage, your unmet needs, they surface, not to torment you, but because now, finally, there's space. And the ego panics. It wants answers, goals, identity. But the self whispers instead, let go. I am forming something deeper. This is where the real work begins, not in action, but in surrender, not in clarity, but in witnessing. The psyche is metabolizing years of performance, illusion, and noise. You feel paralyzed, but that's only because you're finally still enough to feel what you've buried. What if your next move doesn't shout? It softly hums with truth, and then, just when you think you'll never feel drive again, something stirs. Not a spark, not a blaze, but a hum, a pulse, a soul-led whisper that says, move. Not because you must, but because it would be a betrayal of truth not to. Jung called this the emergence of the self, not as an abstract theory, but as a living compass inside you. It doesn't command, it calls. And what it calls you toward isn't success, it's wholeness. This is the new fuel. It doesn't roar, it hums, it doesn't push, it aligns. You begin to move, not from pressure, but from presence. Not to prove something, but because something in you says yes. What if the most extraordinary life is built on quiet, soul-powered choices? You've crossed the threshold. You've tasted the silence, not as stagnation, but as sacred pause. You've wandered through the dark night of your soul, and now something ancient rises, not a voice, not a plan, a pull. This is what Carl Jung called the symbolic life, a life no longer ruled by ego or performance, but one guided by the language of dreams, instincts, synchronicities, and soul. You stop forcing things, you begin responding. The world may still be loud, but you're no longer chasing clarity. You recognize it when it gently arrives. Living from the self doesn't mean you'll always be energized or certain. Grief, doubt, and fatigue will still visit. That's part of being human. But what disappears is the ache of pretending. You no longer perform a version of yourself just to survive. What if your most powerful fuel is no longer adrenaline, but alignment? Something shifts. You begin creating even if no one sees it. You start saying no, even when yes is expected. You follow wonder, not deadlines. You choose peace over performance, purpose over pressure. This is not stagnation. It is sacred fuel. And this motivation, it gets things done, not from depletion, but from devotion. Devotion to what is true, what is real, what makes you feel most alive. This is the self's motivation, not to impress, but to express. You move forward not because you should, but because your whole being says yes. So if you've been wondering where your spark went after awakening, remember, it's not gone. The old fire burned out because it was never meant to last. What rises in its place is a deeper flame, one that doesn't flicker when the world storms around it. What if this stillness isn't the end, but your most sacred beginning? Carl Jung never promised ease, but he promised depth. And if you are here now, watching this, resonating with these words, then you're already on the path. This isn't the end of your awakening. It's the beginning of your becoming. If even one part of this message stirred your heart, if a single phrase mirrored what you've been silently carrying, know this: you are not alone. There are others walking this path, and your story, however unfinished, might be the very lantern someone else needs in their darkness. If you know someone who's silently suffering, thinking love must hurt or peace must be earned, please share this message with them. Here on Beyond the Realm, we go beneath the surface. We explore the hidden architecture of the psyche. We listen for the whispers of the unconscious. We remember that the greatest relationship we'll ever form is the one within. And when the right person does appear, your soul will recognize them, not through fear, but through peace. But until that day, let your deepest relationship be with your own truth. That is your home. That is your root. And from that wholeness, everything real begins. Until next time, I'll see you on the path.